Hey, welcome. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating guidebook, one that claims to have a kind of step-by-step formula for working through some of life's biggest and messiest challenges. So let's get right into it and unpack what this is all about. We've all been there. Whether it's conflict at work, friction at home, or just that kind of nagging feeling inside that something's not quite right. We're always looking for solutions, right? But the real question is, where do we find answers that actually stick? So, the source for our explainer today is a seminar textbook that lays out a very methodical, very structured framework for personal growth. Now, our goal here is simply to explain the system it presents. We're treating it as a really interesting case study in how one specific worldview diagnoses and offers solutions to life's universal problems. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at how this guidebook even frames our problems in the first place. Then we'll get into its 7 core principles. After that, we'll zoom in on 2 key ideas, design and authority, before tackling the main event, the problem of resentment and the 4 steps to overcome it. And finally, we'll see how all of this supposedly leads to something the text calls true success. First up, the framework itself. The argument in this guidebook is that before we can even think about solving our problems, we have to diagnose them correctly. And that means we have to dig way deeper than just what's happening on the surface. So the guidebook maps out our conflicts in these 3 layers. At the very top, you've got the surface problem. This is the stuff you can see, right? The arguments, the bad habits. But it argues these are just symptoms. Just below that, you find the surface causes, the attitudes driving the behavior, like anger or fear. But the real issue, the root cause, is said to be way down deep in foundational character issues like resentment. And this entire system is built on fixing things at that deepest level. Okay, so if resentment and these character flaws are the root problems, what's the solution? Well, the guidebook proposes what it calls 7 universal principles of life, and this is really the core of the whole teaching. And this table, this lays out the entire system in a nutshell. Each of these 7 principles is kind of like a formula. You take a specific action, and you're promised a specific outcome. For instance, the principle of design says you thank God for how you're made, and the result is self-acceptance. Or the principle of suffering says you forgive your enemies, and the promised outcome is true joy. It's all presented as one complete interlocking system. All right, let's zoom in on those first 2 principles, which are really the foundation for everything else, design and authority. These are all about how we see ourselves and how we see our relationships with other people. So the first principle, design, basically argues that a lot of our inner struggles come from not accepting ourselves for who we were created to be. The text suggests that even the things we see as our biggest flaws or shortcomings are actually part of a divine plan, and that accepting them and even being thankful for them is the very first step toward having any kind of inner peace. So that's our inner world. But what about our external struggles? I mean, who hasn't had a conflict with a boss, a parent, or someone in a position of authority? Well, the second principle, the principle of authority, tackles this head-on. And here's where we see a really crucial contrast. The guidebook shows our natural, almost gut reactions, versus what it calls the correct response. So instead of getting defensive when you're criticized, this framework says you should examine yourself for blind spots. Instead of secretly being happy when an adversary has problems, it says you should go and meet their needs. It's a pretty radical call to shift your whole perspective from self-preservation to self-examination. And this brings us to what is really the dramatic heart of this whole framework. If you fail to respond in that correct way, and instead let bitterness fester, the text claims you build something it calls a stronghold of resentment. So what on earth is a stronghold? While the guidebook defines it as a mindset, a way of thinking that goes against God's will, the metaphor it uses is a spiritual fortress, one that an enemy can actually occupy right inside your own soul, using it as a base of operations to launch attacks like fear and anxiety. Now, to support this idea, the text points directly to the Bible, specifically to this verse in Ephesians. You can see how it links unresolved anger directly to giving the devil a foothold, and that idea of a foothold is the foundation for this whole concept of a spiritual stronghold. So, according to this manual, harboring resentment isn't just a psychological problem, it's a spiritual one. It actually creates a vulnerability, what the text calls a legal claim. It's as if you're giving a hostile spiritual force a key to a room in your soul, letting it set up a base inside your life to launch attacks from within. Okay, so if resentment builds this internal fortress, how in the world do you tear it down? The guidebook gets very practical here, and it offers a really clear 4-step process for demolishing it. Here they are, the 4 steps. First, you have to confess that resentment is actually a sin. Second, you ask God to reclaim the spiritual ground you surrendered. Third, you have to actively demolish those wrong ways of thinking by replacing them with truths from Scripture. And finally, the big one, the capstone, you extend mercy and you actually forgive the person who hurt you. And why is that last step so critical? Well, the text again points straight to Scripture. It uses this quote from Matthew to argue that our own forgiveness from God actually depends on our willingness to forgive other people. So in this framework, forgiveness isn't just a nice idea. It is an absolute non-negotiable necessity. Now, after walking through this whole process of inner transformation, we finally get to the last section, the ultimate payoff of living by these principles, which the guidebook calls true success. This framework completely redefines what success even means. It argues that true success has absolutely nothing to do with money or status or any of those worldly accomplishments. Instead, it's all about discovering and then living out the specific purpose you were designed for. This shifts the entire goal of your life away from external achievement and toward an internal alignment with a divine plan. So, how do you find that purpose? Well, the guidebook presents a pretty clear path. It says it all begins with meditating on Scripture, which is supposed to give you divine wisdom for your everyday decisions. And making choices based on that wisdom is what aligns your life with God's plan. And that alignment, that feeling of living out your created purpose, is presented as the ultimate source of fulfillment and success. So, to wrap it all up, this seminar textbook lays out a complete, systematic worldview. The core argument is that all the external problems we face, from arguments to debt to tough relationships, are all just symptoms of deeper internal character flaws, and the main culprit is resentment. The solution, therefore, isn't to try and fix your circumstances, but to fix your character using this very specific set of principles. Which leaves us with a final, really powerful question at the heart of this whole philosophy. And, whether you agree with this specific theology or not, the core idea is pretty provocative. Is the real path to peace and fulfillment found not in scrambling to change our external world, but in systematically changing our internal responses to it? It's definitely something to think about.